Hey Buddhas, Larissa here. We are talking about horse pose. So horse pose is typically a strengthening pose, and we're going to talk about a couple of small details that you can strengthen different parts of your body, and then some specific ways to make sure that you're not harming parts of your body. So horse pose in general is basically wide squat. So this could be a horse pose. A lot of times what happens though is we tend to think that our feet should be turned out. I don't know if you can see this very well, but if I turn my feet out as far as my feet go, and then I try to squat, my knee is coming in while my foot is going out. Long term, that's gonna put a lot of pressure on my knee, not so beneficial. So instead of trying to go to the extreme movement of your feet, look at the movement of your knee and go from there. So if I'm gonna take a wide stance, and I look at where my knees are going, I'm squeezing my butt, I'm pushing my knees wide away from each other. I want to make sure that my feet and my knees are in line, so that way my knees are going to be not taking any undue pressure, and I'm still able to activate my glutes. So from this position here, I can squat down fairly low, I can push my knees nice and wide, and this for me is a pretty good horse stance position. Again, if I turn my feet too wide, not great on my knees. If my feet go straight forward, now it's a lot harder for me to activate my glutes. It's pretty much just going to be quads. So that's the first thing to kind of look at in your horse pose is positioning of your feet, and make sure that your knees are safe first and then position your feet accordingly, rather than trying to position your feet to their widest or narrowest stance possible. So play around with that. The second thing that tends to happen in a horse pose is we tend to think that our hips should be parallel to the ground, which can be okay, but it's not necessarily the most beneficial way to take the pose every single time. The other thing to think about is just the compression on your hips. And this doesn't have anything to do with flexibility or anything else, but if we just look at my hips, if I lift my leg straight out to the side, that's as far out as it'll go before it just hits my hip bone itself. If I go up and around, then I can lift my leg a little bit higher, but if I just simply lift my leg straight out, my hip bone itself will stop it. So that's another thing that's going to be a factor in horse pose. Some people, I can't show you this because I can't do it, but some people are going to be able to bring their legs more in line with their hips, more wide. And then you can look at my position. My leg bone simply won't go any further unless I move my hip as well. So that's another thing to consider. If you're looking around the room and you're seeing some people like in a really low position or their knees are super wide, your legs just might not actually do that. So make sure that you're putting yourself in a good position for your body. And then the other thing with that is to make sure that your butt is working as well. So if I sit up for horse pose and I just squat down, the first thing that's going to want to take over is my quads. Your quads are definitely going to help, but if I come up a little bit taller and first squeeze my butt, then push my knees wide, now all of a sudden there's a lot more work happening in and around my entire hip girdle rather than just the tops of my thighs. So coming up a little bit higher is going to sometimes be more beneficial than going to your deepest point. So that's another thing to kind of consider with your horse pose. What's going to be the most beneficial for you in the moment that you're working. A couple of quick variations to play with horse pose. So I know that horse pose is a strengthening pose, and if you're just hanging out there for an extended period of time, your legs start shaking, there's a lot of work happening. If you want to work on a little bit more stretching, come into your horse pose. Bring your elbows or your forearms inside your knees. You can even grab a hold of your shins and then really gently press your knees wide. Now all of a sudden I've got more support with my arms, but it's working more into an inner groin stretch rather than just working on the strengthening aspects of the pose. So lots of different things you can play with horse pose. Make sure that you're being really mindful of the movement of your knees, the movement of your leg bone within the hip socket. And then final little detail, when we're looking at horse pose, a lot of times what happens is this. If your booty sticks out, your low back is going to take a little undue pressure. Technically, I could hang out here all day. This is a little bit easier, but it's not as beneficial for your body. So make sure that you're lifting your hip points, you have a nice strong core here, your butt's nice and engaged. And then again, you may come up a little bit higher rather than going to that deep depth to find all of that stuff. And then last little thing, if you raise your arms up, this is going to create more intensity in the pose. But the second your arms are above your head,
your shoulder blades become a little wedge and it may start to force that little bit of movement in your low back. So if your arms are up overhead, it's even more important in that position to lift your hip points so you don't end up in this position. Long term, that's not gonna be great for your back. Put yourself in this position here, a lot of strengthening through the entire back of your body. And then of course your core and the front of your legs are gonna be working as well. So, a couple of tips on horse pose. As always, if you have questions, let us know. Happy to help.